Hey guys, Josh Lamaro here from MitoGen and paleoosteo.com. Just wanted to do a quick video on the effects of light as a neurological stimulant in a very simple way for most people to understand how different frequencies of light have an effect on the body. Here we can just see a plant reacting to light. The plants tend to move toward light by activating particular enzymes and chemicals in the side of the plant that is not on the side of the light stimulus, and hence grow that side longer such that the plant bends towards the light. In the human body, of course, this has been probably explained ad nauseum, particularly recently in scientific literature, that light diurnal signals, meaning the difference between night and day, have a profound effect on the way the body runs all of its machinery, from the metabolic processes all the way through to regulating different organ systems. Here's a diagram that just shows molecular clocks dictated by sunlight entering the eye and altering the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, at the top here, which you would call the light-entrained metabolic response, or oscillator. And here the hamburger is the food-entrained metabolic response. So these things are kind of linked to a certain timing in the body that's dictated by diurnal signals. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this kind of thing because I want to talk about the different frequencies of light inherent both in sunlight and in our man-made devices and how they have an effect on our body. Now, some people who know me well know that when I'm not running MitoGen and creating light devices or working as an osteopath and functional medicine doctor, I was a musician. And it occurred to me recently that spectra of light and the spectra of sound can be overlaid on one another and explain quite a few things to people who are not that familiar with talking about the nanometer wavelengths of light. Most people are aware of sound because they listen to music in the car, perhaps CDs or records at home, and everyone has just heard different tones of sound throughout their lifetime. So I've overlaid here the spectra of visible light containing infrared at one end and ultraviolet at the other. Normally when you see this diagram, it's around the other way, but I've found one that was switched around because I want to overlay it on the way that they draw the musical spectra, which is, thankfully I found a diagram that's actually had the corresponding light frequency on the audio spectrum. So down the left here we have subsonic sound, which would be felt as vibration, all the way up to bass tone, which can be both vibration and perceived by the ear. And then as we go up this end, we've got the high end and the supersonic, which is an ear-piercing sort of a high-pitched sound that probably could break glass, like we see in the old movies where somebody sings at a falsetto and smashes the champagne glass. So I've just put these over the top of one another or next to one another so that you can actually see what's really happening in terms of, well, let's talk about how these things would stimulate the nervous system. Most people would agree that a very high-pitched wailing child or a very high-pitched noise is very exhausting on the nervous system. Now, when we're talking about this end of the sound spectrum, we're talking about hertz, which is how many oscillations per second. Now, I'm going to talk about the ear and how these frequencies transfer to the brain and the energy required to compute these signals at the brain level. Let's look at the difference between high end and supersonic. 20,000 hertz is the maximum audible tone in the high end spectrum for the human ear. It's a very, very, very high pitched sound, and at 20,000 oscillations per second moving through air, you can imagine that the tympanic membrane in the ear has to oscillate 20,000 times a second to send that audible signal to the brain. Now, computing 20,000 oscillations a second is going to take up a hell of a lot of energy for the brain, which can kind of explain to us how high-pitched sounds are so exhausting when we compare them to something like 20 oscillations a second in the lowest bass tone. And how many times the tympanic membrane has to oscillate then? Only 1,000th the amount of times per second. So these bass tones use much less energy to compute in the brain, and hence why things like a heartbeat or a very low kind of subtone can be listened to all day and is quite relaxing compared to the high-pitched squeal that would put you on edge in a couple of seconds. Now, in the light spectra, things are quite similar. For those who know what we do, MitoGen make red light therapy devices, photobiomodulation devices. Photobiomodulation, I won't go into too much. There's a bunch of literature out there, and there are many easy to read articles about how this works. But basically, we're using the red and infrared spectrum of light up this end of the diagram to stimulate healing in the body and an increase in energy production. Now, as we come up the other end into the very, very high-powered ultraviolet light, we're getting closer in wavelengths. So the wavelengths are only 400 down to about 380, 320 nanometers apart up in this spectra, and they're 700 all the way up to 1,000 nanometers apart in the red to infrared range. So you can see here, this is only forming a very, very small spectrum of all the electromagnetic radiation that we're exposed to. But we're concerned with this because humans tend to rely on their eyes so much. And we have a similar effect between like very high-pitched sound and very high, what I call high-pitched light. So we're seeing a lot of man-made blue light right now in humankind, which is an exhausting frequency for the body. Once again, got very, very short wavelength light bursting at our eyes all day long. Now, here's a diagram just comparing a couple of the top are two spectra of sunlight. This is what we should normally be seeing throughout a day. So this would be AM sunlight here. You can see that there's a little bit more of a spike in, this is probably midday sunlight, a little bit more of a spike in the UV and the blue range, but it's very well balanced by the red and the infrared. So if we go back to the music analogy, we're sort of talking about a very well balanced mix down in a song, equal amounts of bass tone, high bass, mid-range, and high frequency, which makes for a very easy listening song that sounds balanced. Here we have PM sunlight. You can see that the blue, the high power spectrum seem to drop away, and we've got more of the red, infrared, and the yellows. Think about a sunset. We all know about the quality of a sunset versus a sunrise. Sunrise is a bit brighter, it kind of tends to wake us up. The sunset's very relaxing. It's like it puts you to bed. So down here we have a couple of indoor light sources. I think this one here is a incandescent light, the old school incandescent light, a little bit more like a firelight type spectra. You can see quite a relaxing light to have in your lamps. Unfortunately, they're not making so many of these anymore. This would be a CFL bulb, I think. And here we have the cool white LED and the warm white LED. You can see none of these are as balanced as the sunlight spectra are. So here we may have more base tone, but as you'll soon see, that can balance out the mix of what we're seeing all day, which is a pathological amount of blue. Here we have another diagram showing the same kind of stuff. The fluorescent light here in the top right, very fragmented spikes of different frequencies of light compared to the incandescent, which is more like our relaxing firelight. Here's daylight again, and here's a couple of other sources. Now, we want to talk about the kinds of things that people are exposing themselves to day in, day out, particularly young people who are exposed to technology 24/7. This is the spectra of an iPad Pro, and you can see here the very, very high spike in the 450 nanometer range of blue light, which gives us a saturation of melanopsin, which is a photopigment in the eye that signals to the rest of the body what's happening. Down the bottom, you can see the melanopic lux reading, which is basically a term for how much this saturates the melanopsin receptors in the eye and the skin, and how much it can throw circadian rhythm off when you're exposed to this level of blue all the time. So, any kind of value below 5 melanopic lux is not expected to shift your circadian rhythm very much. But once we get up over 500, it's expected to completely saturate it, and it can fool your brain into thinking that it's day when it's night. I'm of the opinion think these changes start to happen before 50 melanopic lux. So we want to make sure that we're not exposing ourselves to things that have a reading of that value. Now, I think the next slide I have here is what will happen if we block that blue light using blue blocking lenses. And yes, here we go. We've used the UVEX blue blocking lens, and that drops the melanopic lux, or the photosensitivity of our melanopsin and how much it's being disrupted by blue light, down to almost zero. So this is almost akin to sitting next to a fire instead. So those using computers should pay attention to this kind of thing. Here I've just created a little bar graph just to give you an idea of the average office worker or indoor worker's exposure to light of different frequencies. I've coloured it such as it would be coloured in the light spectrum. You can see that most people are getting up in fake light, man-made light that's heavily drenched in blue, sometimes because it's dark in the morning, otherwise just because they get up and put the lights on inside so they can see what's happening. And there's very, very little exposure to full spectrum sun. I've given a couple of just arbitrary amounts here during the day, but here we have AM before work or perhaps even getting to work. So that entails getting in the car, maybe going on public transport, maybe walking. So we've got a little bit of full spectrum sunlight in the morning there given to them. Before they get to work, sit under fake light in front of computers, iPhone, iPad, etc. And then on a good day, going outside, and I'm going to give them an hour or so sitting in full spectrum sunlight. I'd say this is, I don't know how many out of 100 people are actually going outside to experience full spectrum sun during the lunch hour. I'm sure many are even eating inside under fake light too, but I've given this person roughly, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours in the middle of the day before going back to work and home and again being drenched in man-made fake light. So from our stimulatory graphs earlier on, like the music spectrum versus the light spectrum, you can see there's a very, very tiny slither out of this microscopic amount of full spectrum light in this person's day that's actually the healing properties of red light versus an extreme amount of blue light acting as a neurological stimulant, increasing the need for energy in the brain to compute these sorts of light signals. These sorts of things can really explain stuff like cravings, where if the brain's needing more and more energy to compute more and more high-frequency signals, we can quickly see why people crave things like sugar that act very quickly in the body to provide energy. So it's not like cravings are some kind of moral failing. It's actually a primordial need for energy to pay for the kind of stimuli the brain's having to compute. So the antidote obviously is more exposure to sunlight during the day whenever possible. Although when we go back to this graph here and see how much blue we're seeing during a weekday, for example, if we're an office worker, we need our entire weekends to be in full spectrum sun, at least containing some of those red frequencies to help balance the blue. So failing that, MitoGen, of course, we make red light therapy products in order to supplement the parts of the sunlight spectrum that most people are missing. And here's me sitting in front of one of our panels. Here's the panel itself, again available on our webpage, MitoGen.com. All the information about the light spectra emitted from these diodes is on the webpage, as well as the power irradiance and so forth. Of course, we also make a full body light pod. This is for either the more serious home user or professionals to be using with their clients. This is offering optimal doses of red and infrared light for the whole body. Thanks for watching this video, guys. I hope it's been an easy introduction to how different light signals in the body create different experiences and the way that light can act as a neurological stimulus. I've tried to keep it simple on purpose. Of course, we can go into exquisite detail on the inner workings of this down at the cellular level, but for the purposes of this video, it's just to get the message out there. You can check us out at mitogenhealth.com. You can check out my other work at paleoosteo.com, and you can find us on Facebook at MitoGen or Paleo Osteo.